March 4, 1944. 28,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. Hauptmann Klaus Hartmann adjusted his oxygen mask, squinting through the armored glass of his Messerschmitt Bath TEV. Pensy studied the American bomber formation grinding eastward through the frozen sky. 63 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, their contrails stretching behind them like white scars across the Reich. For 3 years, Hartmann had flown these interceptions with the grim satisfaction of a hunter who knew his prey was vulnerable. The Americans came deep, Leipzig, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, but always alone. Their fighter escorts, the twin-engine P-38 Lightnings and the stubby Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, would turn back somewhere over the Dutch coast, fuel gauges bleeding toward empty. Then the killing would begin. Indiada at 3 o'clock high. His wingman transmitted the code word for enemy fighters. Hartmann banked left, scanning the sky. What he saw made no sense. Single-engine fighters, sleek, silver aircraft with distinctive belly radiator scoops and elegant elliptical wings, flying 500 kilometers inside Germany. Over Brunswick, halfway to Berlin. Unmöglich, Hartmann breathed into his radio. Impossible. The Americans called them Mustangs. Hartmann had seen intelligence reports on them. Converted British reconnaissance planes. Initially powered by underpowered Allison engines that made them barely competitive below 15,000 feet. The Luftwaffe had dismissed them. Too light, too. Another failed American experiment in a war where German engineering reigned supreme. But these weren't the same aircraft. Through his gun sight, Hartmann watched as 4 of the silver fighters rolled inverted and dove on a group from JG-11, their Packard-built Merlin engines screaming. The Messerschmitts scattered, but not fast enough. Tracers from 6BF to 50 caliber machine guns converged on the lead 10-9. The German fighter's wing exploded in a shower of aluminum and fabric, and the pilot tumbled earthward in his parachute. 15 seconds. 1 pass. 1 kill. Hartmann's hands tightened on the control stick. In 3 years of combat over the Reich, he had never seen American fighters this far east. The mathematics were impossible. Brunswick lay 525 kilometers from the Channel coast. No single-engine fighter carried enough fuel to reach this deep and still have reserves for combat and return. Yet here they were. All aircraft, engage the escort. Hartmann transmitted, pushing his throttle forward. His engine roared, the DB605 cylinders hammering as the supercharger whined. He climbed toward the sun, using altitude and position, the fundamental advantages that had kept him alive through 247 combat missions. But as he rolled into his attack, something happened that would haunt German fighter pilots for the rest of the war. The Mustangs didn't run, they turned into him. All of them, a coordinated defensive weave that kept every aircraft covered, every angle protected. And they stayed, circling the bombers like silver wolves guarding a flock, their presence declaring something the Luftwaffe had never faced before. The Americans had come to stay. Hartmann fired a burst at 400 meters, saw his rounds fall short, and pulled up hard to avoid a collision. As he climbed away, his fuel gauge caught his eye. He'd been airborne for 35 minutes. In another 20, he'd need to break off and return to base. The Mustangs had been here longer. They'd flown from England, and they weren't leaving. Through his canopy, Hartmann watched as more P-51s dove from the sun, their attack perfectly timed. 2 more Messerschmitts went down. Trailing smoke, the American bombers droned on, untouched, their formation tight and disciplined. For the first time in 3 years, Hauptmann Klaus Hartmann felt something he'd never experienced in combat over his own homeland: helplessness. That evening in the operations room at Wunstorf Airfield, the day's casualty reports came in. Jagdgeschwader 11, 4 aircraft destroyed, 2 damaged. Jag-G1 3 destroyed, Jag-G3 5 destroyed, 1 pilot killed. The American bombers had reached their target, dropped their payload, and returned home. Escorted all the way. It was a fluke, insisted Major Heinz Baer, a veteran ace with 204 victories. They must have staged through forward bases, carried extra fuel. It cannot be sustained. But Hartmann said nothing. He'd seen the fuel tanks the Mustangs had dropped, sleek auxiliary tanks that had given them the range. He'd seen how they fought at altitude, how their engines didn't gasp for air at 28,000 feet like the German fighters did. He'd seen the future, and it was silver. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that the fluke they'd witnessed was the beginning of the end. That the P-51 Mustang, the fighter they'd laughed at just months before, would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter force over the next 14 months. That by war's end, it would be credited with destroying more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. The transformation had begun on a cold March morning over Brunswick, where German pilots discovered that American fighters could now reach Berlin, and there was nothing they could do to stop them. The contempt had begun 18 months earlier, in October 1942, when the first P-51s appeared in European skies. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, flying with Jagdgeschwader 27 over Gieck, had encountered two RAF Mustang Emergers on reconnaissance patrol. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. Stigler's Focke-Wulf 90 easily outclimbed the American-designed fighters, whose Allison V-1710 engines wheezed pathetically above 12,000 feet. He damaged one severely enough to force it home trailing smoke. The Americans have built a sports car and called it a fighter, Stigler reported in his debrief. Fast at low altitude but useless where combat actually occurs. The assessment spread through Luftwaffe squadrons like gossip. Intelligence reports confirmed it. The P-51, powered by its Allison engine, produced only 1,150 horsepower and suffered catastrophic power loss above 15,000 feet. Its single-stage supercharger, adequate for ground attack, was wholly inadequate for high-altitude interception. Meanwhile, German fighters dominated the vertical battlefield. The Messerschmitt B-30 Donade B605 engine and MDOE-50 methanol water injection system could reach 38,000 feet. The Focke-Wulf FVO-90A8 climbed like a homesick angel and rolled faster than anything the Allies possessed. These were purpose-built interceptors, products of a nation that had been perfecting fighter design since 1935. The P-51 was an afterthought, a reconnaissance plane pressed into fighter service because the Americans were desperate. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring himself had dismissed it. In a meeting with fighter commanders in January 1943, he'd reviewed intelligence photos of the new American fighter. Another bastard designed from a mongrel nation, he declared, stubbing out his cigar. They cannot even decide what role it should serve. Reconnaissance, ground attack, fighter. When you try to make one aircraft do everything, it does nothing well. Assembled officers, men like Adolf Galland, Walter Osar and Joseph Priller, nodded in agreement. They had seen American fighters before. The P-40 Warhawk was meat on the table below 15,000 feet. The P-39 Airacobra was so bad the Americans had given most of them to the Russians. Even the vaunted P-38 Lightning, while dangerous, was vulnerable to experienced pilots who understood its compressibility problems in high-speed dives. The P-51 would be no different. Let the British waste their time with it, Galland said, lighting a cigarette. By the time the Americans figure out they need a real fighter, the war will be over. But in October 1942 something happened that would change everything, though the Germans wouldn't learn of it for months. Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a captured P-51 at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. He'd been impressed by the airframe, the laminar-flow wing designed by North American Aviation's Edgar Schmood was aerodynamically brilliant, producing less drag than any fighter wing in existence. The problem was the engine. Harker had an idea. What if they replaced the Allison with a Rolls-Royce Merlin? The British had been perfecting the Merlin for years. The two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine that powered the Supermarine Spitfire could maintain high power output at 30. It produced 1,695 horsepower at takeoff with water injection. nearly 50% more than the Allison. The marriage of American aerodynamics and British engine technology would create something unprecedented. By April 1943, the first Merlin-powered P-51Bs were rolling off production lines in California. Not in Britain, not as experiments, but mass-produced by the thousands in factories that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Luftwaffe intelligence service received reports of the new variant in May 1943. The assessment was unchanged. Marginal improvement over existing model. Still inferior to BKF-29G and FW-190A in combat performance, above 20,000 feet. No significant threat to Reich air defense. They were catastrophically wrong. The Packard V-1650 Merlin, an American-built version of the British engine, transformed the P-51 from a mediocre fighter into a predator. At 25,000 feet, where German fighters began to struggle, the Merlin-powered Mustang was just reaching its optimal performance envelope. Its maximum speed of 43.7 km/h at altitude exceeded every production German fighter except the experimental jets. More importantly, it could fly farther than any single-engine fighter in history. With two 208-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could fly 850 miles to target, fight for 30 minutes, and return home. Total combat radius 850 miles. For the first time, American bombers could be escorted all the way to any target in Germany. But in the autumn of 1943, as the first P-51B groups trained in England, the Luftwaffe remained confident. They'd been fighting the Americans for over a year. They knew the pattern. Bombers would penetrate deep, lose their fighter escort somewhere over the Dutch-German border, and then face the concentrated fury of German interceptors. The Americans called it maximum effort. The Germans called it Reichsverteidigung, defense of the Reich, and they were winning. On October 14, 1943, the Americans launched their second raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Of 91 B-17s dispatched, 60 were shot down and 138 damaged, a catastrophic 20% loss rate. The 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration raids. They simply couldn't sustain such losses. German pilots celebrated. The American strategy of unescorted daylight bombing had failed. The Reich was safe. They will learn. Hauptmann Hartmann told his squadron that October evening that daylight bombing without fighter escort is suicide. Either they will switch to night bombing like the British, or they will give up entirely. Either way, we have won. What Hartmann didn't know was that at that moment in England, the 34th Fighter Group was receiving its first P-51B Mustang. Pilots were learning the aircraft's quirks, its tendencies, its remarkable capabilities. Ground crews were practicing the rapid fueling procedures that would be essential for the long missions ahead, and American planners were drawing red lines on maps. Lines that stretched from England to Berlin to Munich to Vienna. Lines that said, "We're coming, and this time, we're bringing escorts." The Germans had 3 months to prepare. 3 months before the silver fighters appeared over Brunswick. 3 months before the laughter stopped. 3 months before Hauptmann Klaus Hartmann looked up into the winter sky and realized the war had fundamentally changed. The transformation of the P-51 from flawed experiment to war-winning weapon represented one of aviation history's most remarkable engineering achievements. But behind the elegant airframe and powerful engine lay a story of industrial capacity that would prove as decisive as the aircraft itself. North American Aviation had designed the original P-51 in just 117 days during 1940, an impossibly compressed timeline that reflected both American engineering prowess and desperate British need. The Royal Air Force, facing the Luftwaffe alone after Dunkirk, needed fighters immediately. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmude, ironically a German immigrant, had created something revolutionary. The laminar-flow wing was the key. Traditional airfoils of the era generated turbulent airflow over their surfaces, creating drag that limited speed and range. Schmud's design maintained smooth, laminar airflow over 60% of the wing surface, reducing drag by 35% compared to conventional wings. In practical terms, this meant the P-51 could fly farther and faster on the same amount of fuel than any contemporary fighter. The numbers were extraordinary. At 25,000 feet, the P-51B achieved 40-37 mph, faster than the Bf-1009G's 30-86 mph, and the F-90A's 48 mph, at the same altitude. But speed alone didn't win wars. Range did. With internal fuel capacity of 94 gallons and 208-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B carried 400 gallons total, enough for missions exceeding 7 hours. By comparison, the Bf-1009G6 carried just 88 gallons internally, giving it a combat radius of barely 350 miles. German fighters defending Berlin had to operate from bases around the city, scramble to altitude, engage for minutes, then land with minimal fuel reserves. American pilots could cruise from England at economical power settings, drop their external tanks when combat began, fight for 30 minutes at full throttle, and still have enough fuel to reach home. The strategic implications were staggering, but the P-51's most devastating advantage wasn't aerodynamic or mechanical, it was industrial. By March 1944, when Hartmann encountered those first Mustangs over Brunswick, North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, were producing P-51s at a rate that defied German comprehension. At peak production in 1944, one complete P-51 rolled off the assembly line every hour. Not every day, every hour. The Inglewood plant alone employed 42,000 workers operating 3 shifts across 1.5 million square feet of factory space. The production line moved with assembly line precision perfected by the American automotive industry, each worker performing specialized tasks as the airframe moved past, on overhead tracks, wings attached in 14 minutes, engine installed in 11, gun bays fitted in 9, final inspection in 22. German aircraft production, by contrast, remained largely artisanal. The Messerschmitt works at Regensburg employed skilled craftsmen who hand-fitted parts, adjusted tolerances, and treated each aircraft as a semi-custom product. Quality was exceptional, but quantity suffered. In all of 1944, Germany produced 14,212 Bf-109s of all variants, barely more than 1 month's production of American fighters across all types. The Americans were building 16,000 fighters monthly by mid-1944. Even more telling was the engine production disparity. Packard Motor Car Company, converting from automobile manufacturing, was producing 400 V1650 Merlin engines daily at its Detroit facility. By early 90s, these engines, built to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, were essentially identical. A mechanic could swap an engine from one P-51 to another in 4 hours using standardized tools and procedures. German engine production remained bottlenecked. The DB605 power plant required specialized machine tools, skilled machinists, and hand-fitting of critical components. Engines varied in performance even within the same production batch. Some Bf-219s could reach 38,000 feet. Others struggled past 33,000 feet, despite identical specifications. The fuel situation was even more catastrophic. American pilots flew with 100-octane aviation gasoline refined from Texas crude and delivered across the Atlantic by the thousands of tanker loads. This high-octane fuel allowed higher compression ratios, more aggressive supercharger boost, and greater reliability. German pilots by late 1943 were using 87-octane synthetic fuel produced from coal through the Fischer-Tropsch process. The synthetic fuel worked, but it reduced engine performance by 15% and increased maintenance requirements. Worse, Allied bombing was systematically destroying Germany's synthetic fuel plants. By March 1944, Fuel production had dropped 30% from peak levels. Pilot training was being cut. Combat sorties were being rationed. The Americans had fuel to waste. German fighters were being grounded for lack of it. Pilot training revealed another insurmountable gap. American pilots reaching Europe in early 1944 had typically logged 400 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in type, extensive gunnery practice, and thorough instrument training. They'd practiced formation flying until it was instinctive, studied combat tactics, developed from 3 years of war, and trained against captured enemy aircraft to understand their opponent's capabilities. German pilot training had collapsed. New pilots were entering combat with 150 hours total time, sometimes less. Fuel shortages meant minimal gunnery practice. Many young pilots had never fired their guns before their first combat mission. They learned to fly on outdated trainers, transitioned directly to frontline fighters, and were thrown into combat against pilots with double their experience. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. American pilot production exceeded 30,000 annually. German pilot training graduated perhaps 5,000, and the quality declined monthly as experienced instructors were pulled back to combat duties or killed in action. But the P-51's true revolution was strategic. For 3 years, the Americans had bombed Germany by day, while accepting horrific losses. The theory that massed bombers with heavy defensive armament could fight their way to targets and back had proven false. Unescorted bombers were slaughtered. The introduction of long-range fighter escort changed everything. On December 13, 1943, the 34th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group, flew its first mission escorting B-17s to Kiel, Germany. For the first time, American fighters accompanied the bombers beyond the German border. Losses dropped immediately. By February 1944, multiple P-51 groups were operational. Big Week, a concentrated campaign against German aircraft production, saw American bombers strike deep targets with fighter escort the entire way. German losses were catastrophic. 450 fighters destroyed in combat, 300 more destroyed on the ground, and critically, 100 pilots killed, men who couldn't be replaced. The operational statistics from March 4, 1944, the day Hartmann encountered Mustangs over Brunswick, told the story. American forces dispatched 730 heavy bombers escorted by 96 fighters, including 74 P-51s. German defenders scrambled 369 fighters. Results: Americans lost 11 bombers and 5 fighters. Germans lost 79 fighters with 47 pilots killed. An 11-to-1 loss ratio, and it would only get worse. The P-51's armament, while less spectacular than German cannon, proved devastatingly effective. 6 .450 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds of ammunition, later reduced to 270 for outer guns, delivered 4,800 rounds per minute combined, at convergence range typically 300 yards. This created a cone of destruction that German aircraft couldn't survive. Each armor-piercing incendiary round weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second. A 2-second burst put 160 rounds into the target zone. German fighters built for weight efficiency used thin aluminum skin that 50 caliber rounds penetrated easily, fuel tanks ignited, control surfaces shredded. Pilots: the P-51 had become what the Germans feared most, an escort fighter that could match their interceptors in performance while ranging twice as far. It didn't need to dominate in every performance category. It just needed to be good enough and be there. And by March 1944, it was everywhere. March 6, 1944. 2 days after Hartmann's encounter over Brunswick, the Luftwaffe's 700 AM briefing at Duberitz Fighter Command was unusually tense. Major General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, general of the fighter force, stood before a map of Germany marked with red pins showing the previous day's losses. His face was drawn, his signature cigar unlit. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice tight, "we are facing a new reality." The assembled squadron commanders shifted in their seats. These were the Experten, the Aces, men with hundreds of kills between them. They'd survived Poland, France, Britain, Russia. They weren't accustomed to concerning Gallen's voice. On March 4th, American fighters escorted bombers to Brunswick, 425 kilometers inside Germany. Yesterday they reached Berlin. Today's intelligence reports suggest Munich is next. A murmur rippled through the room. Berlin, the Reich capital, 580 miles from the English coast. This is impossible, said Major Heinz Baer flatly. No single-engine fighter has that range. Galland slid a photograph across the table. It showed a crashed P-51B, its wings torn away by flak. Clearly visible were the attachment points for drop tanks. They carry 108-gallon auxiliary tanks under each wing. They drop them before combat begins. The range problem, Galland said bitterly, has been solved. On March 8, 1944, the full weight of the new American strategy became clear. Over 600 heavy bombers struck targets across Germany, escorted by over 900 fighters, including 280 P-51 Mustangs. For the first time, American fighters swept German skies from the Channel to beyond Berlin. Hauptmann Hartmann lifted off from Wunstorf at 11:47 a.m., leading his Staffel toward a reported bomber formation near Hanover. At 24,000 feet, his wingman called out the Americans. "Mein Gott," the young pilot breathed. "I've never seen so many." The sky was filled with them. Not just bombers. Hartmann had seen large formations before, but fighters, dozens of silver P-51s in loose formations, weaving protectively around their charges. For every bomber there seemed to be a fighter. Hartmann selected a straggling B-17, its number 3 engine trailing smoke, the perfect target, wounded, falling behind, vulnerable. He rolled inverted and dove, his wingman tucked in tight. At 1,000 meters, tracers flashed past his canopy. Hartmann broke hard left, his vision graying as G-forces crushed him into his seat. TARS, P-51s had dropped from above, perfectly positioned. They'd been waiting. The Mustangs didn't pursue. They pulled up, rejoined their formation and continued guarding the bombers, disciplined, patient, professional. Hartmann tried again, approaching from the sun. Again Mustangs intercepted him before he could fire. Again they broke off after forcing him away, refusing to be drawn into individual dogfights. It was a new tactic, and it was devastatingly effective. The Americans weren't trying to destroy every German fighter. They were simply preventing them from reaching the bombers, and with their numbers, their range, and their altitude performance, they could. After 30 minutes of fruitless attacks, Hartmann's fuel gauge forced him to break off. He'd fired perhaps 200 rounds at extreme range, scored no hits, achieved nothing. The bombers droned on, untouched. That evening, Hartmann attended the debriefing at Dubberitz. The reports from other units told the same story. Jagdgeschwader 1, 3 aircraft lost, no confirmed bomber kills. JG-3, 5 aircraft lost, 2 probables. JG-11, 7 aircraft lost, 1 confirmed. 38 German fighters destroyed, perhaps 8 bombers. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, the pilot who'd dismissed the P-51 18 months earlier, sat in silence as the numbers were read. Finally, he spoke. "They don't fight the way we do. They don't chase. They don't try to prove themselves. They stay with their bombers like sheepdogs with a flock, and when we come close, they simply push us away. So we make them fight," snapped Major Baer. "We attack in force, overwhelm them with numbers." Galland shook his head slowly. "We tried that today. We scrambled 379 fighters. They had over 900. The numbers favor them now." The silence was profound. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had enjoyed numerical superiority over any single raid. Now the balance had shifted. March 15, 1944. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, commanding officer of Kubel JG-11, recorded his encounter with P-51s in his combat diary, a diary that would survive the war and shock historians with its candor. "We attacked a formation of liberators near Münster, altitude 26,000 feet. The bombers were surrounded by at least 40 Mustangs. I selected one and made a head-on pass. My shells struck his engine. I saw the hits clearly. He kept flying. These American fighters absorb incredible damage. I attempted to disengage by diving to the left. 3 Mustangs followed me down. At 15,000 feet, I leveled out and pushed my throttle to the firewall. My airspeed indicator showed 650 kilometers per hour, nearly my maximum speed. They stayed with me. Not just stayed, they closed the distance. At 5,000 feet, with my fuel nearly exhausted, they finally broke off. Perhaps they too were low on fuel. Perhaps they simply chose to let me go. I will never know. What I do know is this. The Mustang is faster than the 109 at all altitudes above 20,000 feet. It dives faster. It has greater range, and there are hundreds of them. We cannot win this war in the air anymore. We can only hope to survive it. Noakes' assessment was brutally accurate. The P-51's performance advantages, marginal in any single category, combined into overwhelming superiority. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin engine produced maximum power while the DB-605 wheezed in the thin air. The Mustang's top speed of 437 mph exceeded the 109's 386 mph by 51 mph, enough that German pilots couldn't catch a Mustang that chose to run, couldn't escape a Mustang that chose to pursue. In a dive, the gap widened. The P-51's laminar-flow wing remained effective at speeds where German fighters experienced control problems. Pilots reported diving at indicated speeds of 500 mph while maintaining control authority. The Bf-109's controls stiffened dangerously above 450 mph, and the FW-190's ailerons became nearly immovable. But the psychological impact cut deeper than performance statistics. For 3 years, German pilots had owned German skies. They scrambled from bases near their targets, climbed to altitude, engaged at will, and landed with fuel to spare. The Americans came as raiders, brief, violent, then gone. Now the Americans stayed. They circled overhead for hours. They patrolled at altitudes where German fighters struggled. They appeared over Berlin itself, the symbolic heart of the Reich, and German fighters couldn't stop them. Worse, every mission revealed more Mustangs. In December 1943, the Luftwaffe faced 1 P-51 group. By March 1944, there were 6. By May, there would be 13. The Americans weren't just winning, they were drowning the Luftwaffe in numbers. April 8, 1944, Hauptmann Hartmann returned from a mission over Frankfurt to find his ground crew gathered around the radio. Hitler was speaking, his voice shrill with rage. Our fighters will sweep the American bombers from our skies. Our pilots, the finest in the world, will defend the fatherland with German courage and German steel. One of the mechanics, a veteran who'd served since Poland, turned off the radio. He looked at Hartmann with tired eyes. Herr Hauptmann, is it true? Can we still win? Hartmann removed his flying gloves slowly, choosing his words carefully. Around them, other pilots were gathering, waiting for his answer. We can still fight, he said finally. Whether we can win, he trailed off, staring at the distant sky where contrails marked another American formation, passing unmolested overhead. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. On April 11, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched 930 bombers against targets across Germany, escorted by 835 fighters. The Luftwaffe scrambled 450 fighters in response. Results: 15 American bombers lost, 10 American fighters lost. German losses: 98 fighters destroyed, 60 pilots killed. The mathematics of attrition had become a death sentence, and in the operations rooms, on the flight lines, in the cockpits of Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs, German pilots were reaching the same terrible conclusion that Hartmann had reached over Brunswick on March 4. The Silver Fighters had changed everything, and there was no going back. By May 1944, the strategic collapse of the Luftwaffe's day fighter force was no longer a matter of debate, it was statistical fact. In the 3 months since P-51s had begun escorting bombers to Berlin, the Luftwaffe had lost 2,262 fighter pilots killed or missing, an average of 25 per day. These weren't just numbers. They were the Experten, the veterans who'd survived years of combat, who understood air warfare instinctively, who could train the next generation. Each loss was irreplaceable. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, who would survive the war with 176 victories, watched his squadron dissolve like snow in spring. We received 14 replacement pilots in April, he recorded. 12 were killed in their first month. The 2 survivors had perhaps 20 hours in the Bf-109 before entering combat. They flew like students at a training school, cautious, hesitant, terrified. Against the Mustangs they had no chance. The Americans, by contrast, were building pilot strength daily. By June 1944, the 8th Air Force would field 1,537 fighters, the majority P-51s. Each pilot arrived with 400-plus hours of training. Each aircraft was maintained to exacting standards. Each mission was supported by a logistics system that delivered 100-octane fuel, ammunition and spare parts in quantities that seemed limitless. The industrial disparity had translated into operational dominance. General der Jagdflieger, Adolf Galland, submitted a report to Reichsmarschall Göring on May 1st that was blunt to the point of insubordination. The appearance of American long-range escort fighters over the Reich has fundamentally altered the aerial warfare situation. Our fighters can no longer intercept bomber formations without facing numerically superior escort fighters that match or exceed our performance at combat altitudes. Our losses are unsustainable. In 4 months, we have lost 1,000 pilots killed. At current rates, the entire day fighter force will be destroyed within 6 months. Not by lack of aircraft, but by lack of trained pilots to fly them. The enemy's advantage in numbers, training, fuel, and now aircraft performance makes victory in the air mathematically impossible. Göring's response was to relieve Galland of operational command and order him to stop defeatist talk. The Reich Marshal insisted that German pilots simply needed to show more courage, more determination, more National Socialist will. But courage couldn't overcome fuel exhaustion. Determination couldn't dodge .50 caliber rounds. Will couldn't fly a fighter that was grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. The fuel crisis had become catastrophic. Allied bombing, particularly the May 12th attack on Germany's synthetic fuel plants, had reduced production by 50% in a single day. Pilot training flights were cancelled. Veteran pilots were limited to 2 or 3 sorties per week. Entire Gruppen sat grounded while Americans flew overhead. Lieutenant Hans Berger, assigned to JG-26 in May 1944, described the hopelessness in a letter to his brother. "We hear the bombers coming every morning. Sometimes we scramble. Sometimes we sit in our cockpits and wait for fuel that never arrives. When we do fly, we climb to 27,000 feet and find ourselves outnumbered 3-1 by fighters that are faster, climb better, and have more fuel than we do. Yesterday, I fired all my ammunition at a single Mustang. I saw my shells strike his wing and fuselage. He simply flew away, trailing a bit of smoke. Their aircraft absorbed damage that would destroy 3 Messerschmitts. We lost 4 pilots. I claimed 1 bomber as a probable. This is what victory looks like now." The P-51's impact extended beyond air combat into strategic bombing effectiveness. With fighter escort available for the entire mission, American bombers could strike targets with devastating precision. On May 28 and 29, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched coordinated attacks on German synthetic oil production. Over 2,000 bombers, escorted by nearly 1,000 fighters including 650 P-51s, struck refineries at Politz, Merseburg, Seitz, and Lützgendorf. The escorts destroyed 91 German fighters while losing only 4 of their own. The bombers destroyed 18 refineries. By June 1944, D-Day, German fuel production had collapsed to 30% of March levels. The Luftwaffe, which had consumed 180,000 tons of aviation fuel monthly in 1943, received 54,000 tons in June 1944. Rationing became severe. Training stopped entirely. Combat operations were prioritized, but even frontline units flew on a fuel budget that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Meanwhile, the Americans were consuming 1.4 million gallons of aviation fuel daily in Europe alone, and receiving 1.6 million gallons. They were accumulating reserves while fighting. The psychological destruction ran deeper than statistics suggested. German pilots had entered the war believing in their technological and tactical superiority. By mid-1944, that belief had been shattered. Hauptmann Klaus Hartmann, who'd laughed at American fighters in 1942, wrote in his private journal on June 10, 1944, "Today I flew my 300th combat mission. I have 38 confirmed victories. By the standards of 1942, I am an expert. By the standards of 1944, I am a survivor. The Mustangs are over Germany every day now. Morning, afternoon, evening, they appear at altitudes where we can barely function, escorting bombers that destroy our cities while we watch helplessly. We scramble with half fuel, fight for minutes, then run for home before our tanks empty. I have watched better pilots than me die. I have watched boys with 50 hours of training die in their first combat. I have watched the Luftwaffe that conquered Poland and France wither into a shadow force that cannot defend its own capital. The Americans did not beat us with superior courage or better tactics. They beat us with something simpler and more devastating. They built more fighters, trained more pilots, and produced more fuel than we could destroy. The war is lost. Not today, not tomorrow, but inevitably. The only question is how many more of us will die before someone admits it. By July 1944, the operational statistics told an unambiguous story. In January 1944, before P-51s achieved numerical superiority, American bomber losses averaged 6.2% per mission, unsustainable. By July, with Mustang escorts dominating German skies, losses had dropped to 1.9%, operationally acceptable. German losses had inverted. In January, the Luftwaffe claimed 300 bombers destroyed for losses of 150 fighters. By July, they claimed 80 bombers destroyed for losses of 400 fighters. The kill ratio had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. Worse, the quality of German replacement pilots had collapsed so completely that experienced pilots refused to fly with them. Oberst Johannes Trautloft, commanding a Jagdgeschwader, reported, "I received 18 replacement pilots in June. 5 were killed before firing their guns in combat. 8 more died in July. The remaining 5 are so traumatized I cannot deploy them without veteran escorts, and I have no veterans to spare." The Americans, by contrast, were rotating experienced pilots home after completing tours, using them as instructors to train the next generation. German experience died in cockpits over the Reich. On July 7, 1944, a force of 1129 American bombers struck targets across central Germany. They were escorted by 715 fighters, including 467 P-51s. The Luftwaffe scrambled 200 fighters, less than one-fifth the escort strength. Results: 12 American bombers lost, 3 fighters lost. German losses: 52 fighters destroyed, 31 pilots killed. The Luftwaffe had ceased to be an effective defensive force. It had become a target. In August 1944, Reichsmarschall Göring addressed fighter commanders at Marienhof, his hunting estate. His speech, recorded by multiple witnesses, revealed the depth of German desperation. "Gentlemen, I have promised the Führer that we will stop the American bombing. You have failed me. You have failed the Reich. You claim you need better aircraft, more fuel, more pilots. What you need is more courage. Every man in this room will fly combat missions personally. You will show your pilots how to fight. You will demonstrate National Socialist." Adolf Galland, recently reinstated after Göring realized no one else could manage the collapsing fighter force, responded with icy calm, "Herr Reichsmarschall, courage cannot overcome fuel exhaustion. We cannot shoot down Mustangs that are faster and more numerous. We have lost this air war because the Americans produce more of everything, aircraft, pilots, fuel, ammunition, than we can destroy. This is industrial reality, not a morale problem." Göring's face purpled with rage. "You are relieved of command." "Very well," Galland replied. "Who will you replace me with? And what will you tell them to do differently?" There was no answer, because there was no solution. The P-51 Mustang had done what no other weapon system had achieved. It had rendered the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy obsolete. German fighters couldn't reach the bombers. When they tried, Mustangs intercepted them. When they engaged the Mustangs, more Mustangs arrived. When they broke off to refuel, the bombers continued untouched. By September 1944, Germany was producing fighters faster than it could train pilots to fly them. Fields held hundreds of brand-new B-409s and F-90s with empty cockpits. Meanwhile, American P-51 groups operated at full strength, with replacement aircraft and pilots arriving faster than losses could deplete them. The mathematics were final. The Luftwaffe was being destroyed not in single catastrophic battles, but through industrial attrition, ground down day by day, mission by mission, until nothing remained. And the silver fighters that German pilots had laughed at in 1942 circled overhead, untouchable. January 14, Duberitz Airfield, outside Berlin. Hauptmann Klaus Hartmann stood on the frozen tarmac, watching mechanics work on a B-409K4, the latest variant supposedly superior to earlier models. Around him, the airfield was strangely quiet. No engines warming up, No pilots gathering for briefing, just the wind howling across empty concrete and the distant rumble of artillery from the Eastern Front. Hartmann was 29 years old. He'd been flying combat missions since 1940, Poland, France, Britain, Russia, now the defense of the Reich, 5 years of war, 48 combat missions, 52 confirmed victories. He was one of the few left. Of the 18 pilots who'd served in his original staffel in 1940, only he remained. The rest were dead, captured or so badly wounded they'd never fly again. The replacements who'd cycled through his unit, boys, really teenagers with dreams of glory, had died even faster. He'd stopped learning their names after a while. It hurt less that way. Above him, contrails marked another American formation passing overhead. Bombers, escorted by fighters, they flew at 28,000 feet, untouchable. Their formations tight and disciplined. Hartmann didn't bother counting them anymore. There were always more. The Luftwaffe had scraped together perhaps 60 serviceable fighters in the Berlin defense zone. The Americans would send 800 today, maybe. The numbers had become absurd, meaningless. His ground crew chief, Feldwebel Ernst Weber, a veteran himself, too old for combat but too experienced to waste, approached with a clipboard. Fuel for one sortie, Herr Hauptmann. 30 minutes at combat power, maybe 40 at cruise. Ammunition for perhaps 2 firing passes. That's all we have left. Hartmann nodded. It was more than many units received. The 10E9 is ready, Weber continued. Engine is good. Guns are zeroed. But, he hesitated. But what? Sir, where will you land when your fuel runs out? Tempelhof is cratered. Oranienburg is under artillery fire. Doberitz may be overrun by tomorrow. Hartmann had no answer. The geography of defeat was shrinking daily. A car approached. A staff car flying pennants. It stopped and a Luftwaffe general emerged. General Major Adolf Galland, no longer General der Jagdflieger, but now commanding JV-44, an elite unit equipped with the new Me-26-2 jets. Hartmann, Galland said, returning the salute. Walk with me. They moved away from the ground crew, their boots crunching on frost. I'm forming a jet squadron, Galland said without preamble. Experienced pilots only. I want you. Hartmann had heard about the Me-26-2, a revolutionary fighter, capable of 540 miles/hour, faster than any Allied aircraft, but he'd also heard the problems: engines that lasted 25 hours before failure, fuel consumption that made the jet impractical, and allies who'd learned to catch them during takeoff and landing. Will it matter? Hartmann asked quietly. Galland stopped walking. For a long moment he stared at the contrails overhead. No, he admitted. Probably not. The Americans have 2,000 fighters in theater. We have perhaps 300 operational aircraft total, including jets. They produce 50 P-51s daily. We produce 5 jets weekly. The mathematics. He trailed off. Then why continue? Because, Galland said, his voice hardening, German pilots don't surrender. Because these boys, he gestured toward a group of teenage pilots huddled near a hangar, deserve leaders who'll fight to the end. Because history will remember whether we died with courage or simply gave up. Hartmann looked at the teenagers. They wore uniforms too large for their thin frames. Their eyes held something between fear and fanaticism, the look of boys who'd been told they were defending civilization against barbarians. He thought of Brunswick, March 4, 1944, the day he'd first seen P-51s over Germany, the day he'd realized the war was lost. That had been 10 months ago. Since then he'd watched the Luftwaffe dissolve, watched fuel stocks vanish, watched cities burn, watched boys die because old men refused to admit defeat. I'll think about it, Hartmann said finally. Galland nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. Don't think too long, we're running out of everything. Fuel, time, Reich. After Galland left, Hartmann returned to his aircraft. He climbed into the cockpit, running through the familiar pre-flight checks. The instruments glowed softly. The controls felt solid in his hand. For a moment he could pretend it was 1940 again, when German fighters ruled the sky and victory seemed inevitable. Then he looked up and saw the contrails. Always the contrails. Feldwebel, Weber appeared at the cockpit. "Sir, should I have them fuel the aircraft?" Hartmann sat in silence, his gloved hands on the control stick. He thought about all the missions, all the victories, all the friends lost. He thought about the silver fighters that had appeared over Brunswick and changed everything. The P-51 Mustang, the fighter they'd laughed at, dismissed as inadequate, ignored until it was too late. "No," Hartmann said finally, unbuckling his harness. "No, Ernst. Save the fuel. There will be no mission today." "Sir." Hartmann climbed down from the cockpit. He removed his flying gloves, slowly, methodically, as if each finger required deliberate thought. "The war is over, Ernst. Not officially, not today, but it's over. Those fighters up there," he pointed at the contrails, "they proved it. Not through superior courage or better tactics, but through something simpler. They built more. They trained more pilots. They produced more fuel. They never ran out of anything while we ran out of everything." Weber said nothing. Around them, other pilots and crew members had stopped working, listening. In 1942, Hartmann continued, his voice carrying across the frozen airfield. "We laughed at the Mustang. We called it a reconnaissance plane, pretending to be a fighter. We said American aircraft were inferior, that American pilots lacked courage, that American industry produced quantity without quality." He paused, watching another formation pass overhead. 30,000 feet up, untouchable, unstoppable. "We were wrong. About all of the Americans didn't just build fighters. They built a system. Production lines that ran day and night. Training programs that graduated thousands of pilots. Logistics networks that delivered fuel across oceans. They created an air force that could absorb losses and grow stronger while we bled to death." One of the young pilots, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, spoke up hesitantly. "But sir, we're German pilots. The best in the world. Surely if we just fight harder." "No," Hartmann cut him off, his voice gentle, but firm. "No, son. We are good pilots. Perhaps even great pilots. But we're fighting an enemy that doesn't need to be great. They just need to be good enough and have 1,000 fighters to our 100. That's not a war. That's mathematics." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the distance, an explosion, Allied bombs perhaps, or Soviet artillery. The Reich was burning from all directions. "Herr Hauptmann," Weber asked quietly, "what do we do now?" Hartmann looked at the young pilots, at the mechanics, at the aircraft that would never fly combat missions again. He thought of all the German pilots who died in the past 2 years, shot down by silver fighters they'd once dismissed as jokes. "We survive," he said finally. "We survive so that when this is over, we can tell the truth about what happened here. So that history will know Germany didn't lose the air war because of cowardice or poor tactics or inferior courage. We lost because we challenged a nation that could build P-51s faster than we could shoot them down. We lost because we faced an enemy whose industrial capacity made our best efforts irrelevant." He turned to walk away, then stopped. The Mustang didn't defeat us through superior technology. Every advantage it had, speed, range, altitude, performance, was marginal. What defeated us was that America built 15,000 of them while training 30,000 pilots and producing unlimited fuel. They created abundance we couldn't match, and abundance, not superiority, wins industrial wars. Hartmann walked toward the operations building, leaving the silent airfield behind. Above, the contrails continued their inexorable march eastward, silver lines writing the final chapter of the Luftwaffe across German skies. That evening, Hartmann wrote his final combat report. It was unusually brief. No mission flown, no enemy encountered. The fuel allocated for today's operations has been reserved for tomorrow, though we have no reason to believe tomorrow will be different from today. The Americans continue to operate over the Reich without effective opposition. The cause is not cowardice or lack of will. The cause is that we have run out of everything, while they have run out of nothing. The appearance of the P-51 Mustang in numbers over Germany in early 1944 marked the end of the Luftwaffe as an effective force. We simply didn't realize it at the time. We do now. He signed his name, filed the report, and removed his wings. the Luftwaffe insignia he'd worn since 1938. Outside, night fell over Duberitz, the sound of aircraft engines faded, the sky darkened. But in the morning, the contrails would return. They always did. The silver fighters that German pilots had laughed at, dismissed, underestimated, ignored, had rewritten the rules of air warfare. They'd proven that in modern war, industrial capacity trumped tactical brilliance, that quantity had a quality all its own, and that the nation which could field 1,000 good fighters would always defeat the nation with 100 great ones. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the P-51 Mustang had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter, 4,950 in the air, 4,131 on the ground. Nearly 9,000 German aircraft eliminated by a fighter that Luftwaffe pilots had once called inadequate. The laughter had stopped over Brunswick on March 4, 1944. It never returned.